funny. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Mitchell Lecture. My name is Tim Parsons. I'm Chair of Designed Objects within the Architecture, Interior Architecture and Design Objects Department here at SAIC. And I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Carter to SAIC. Before I introduce Sarah properly, I want to mention our next and final Mitchell Lecture of this semester. On Tuesday, December 3rd, architect, writer and historian Dr. Arijit Sen will give a lecture entitled Citizen Preservationists, Values, Voices and Methods to Act in Our World. And Dr. Sen is Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And his research includes studies of the architecture of South Asian immigrant communities in Northern California, New York, and in Chicago. And he's also worked on post-disaster reconstruction and community-engaged design in the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, among many other projects. I also want to remind you that the Bodies exhibition, featuring work by Introduction to Designed Objects students and curated by AIUDO faculty Megan Euchre, who's here in the audience tonight, opened last week and runs through until February 16th at the International Museum of Surgical Science. So I recommend you going to check it out. It's a really great show. I also wanted to congratulate Seth Keller, who is featured in this New City Design Edition, which has just come out. There are a few copies here for you to collect at the end. Seth, as some of you will know, is faculty in AIADO and runs our Sullivan Fabrication Studio. And so, to tonight's lecture. Sarah Carter is the visiting executive director of the Center for Design and Material Culture and visiting assistant professor in design studies in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She previously served as the curator and director of research at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. If you're not familiar with Chipstone, it's a foundation whose mission is to promote and enhance appreciation and knowledge of American material culture, with a particular emphasis on the decorative arts. And while at Chipstone, Sarah collaboratively curated many innovative museum exhibitions, including Mrs. M's Cabinet at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and Florence Eisman Designing Childhood for the American Century at the Museum of Wisconsin Art. She also directed Chipstone's think tank program in support of progressive curatorial practice. But what drew our attention in particular was her recent book, Object Lessons, How 19th Century Americans Learned to Make Sense of the Material World. We're all probably familiar with the term object lesson, meaning a practical example of an idea or principle. But what you may be less familiar with, and what Sarah is going to illuminate for us tonight, is that the history of the phrase originated in actual classroom exercises from the mid-19th century that used objects to help children learn about the world directly through their senses and observations. The prologue to the book opens with a wonderful passage, which I'm going to embarrass Sarah by reading out now, and it goes like this. I would like this book to arrive packed away at the bottom of a heavy box of carefully selected things. Each item piled on top of this narrow volume would be individually packed in its own small compartment. There would be no labels. On the way to the buried title page, you would be challenged to differentiate flax from hemp, whalebone from India rubber, slate from granite, and mace from fragrant ginger. Perhaps you might stop to unwrap an oyster shell, a pair of scissors, or a hunk of porcelain. A particular item might force you to pause and to wonder. This passage reminded me that I had heard that the Italian master of design, Achille Castiglione, used to bring a huge suitcase of objects to his classes when he was teaching at the Politecnico di Milano. Each item was carefully chosen to reveal a particular design principle or material or process quality. Those of you who were here for last week's lecture by Bruce Tharp on discursive design will have learned that a lot of design work today makes use of the object's ability to communicate ideas, to convey meaning, and to prompt discussion on subjects of import. The history of how objects have been used to educate us illuminates this potential and should provide new insight into how we might become better designers of objects, spaces, and environments. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Carter.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that lovely introduction. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Good? Great, thanks. And thank you also for inviting me here today to talk about object lessons. It's exciting for me to be in a place where I'm surrounded by designers who create meaningful things and people who research the history of objects in interesting ways. It's a wonderful place to share this story. And at the core of my research that resulted in this book, Object Lessons, How 19th Century Americans Learned to Make Sense of the Material World, and it's resulted in a number of ongoing pedagogical and research projects I completed at the Chipstone Foundation and continue to work on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I focused on the history of connecting objects and ideas, and thinking about the vital question of how do we know what we know about the world? And that's a question that really animates a lot of my research, both methodologically and topically. How do we know what we know about the world? How do we know what we know about the objects and things that we create or engage with? And this project led me to explore ways in which children engage with the world in a sensory way. Beyond the reading, writing, and arithmetic we often think about and connected to early American education, as a way to understand American and material and intellectual life in the long 19th century. And to build on that history, the history of object lessons, to develop some productive strategies for engaging with objects today in both our classrooms and in our museums. And I think a lot about this history as being very relevant to the way we work with and teach with and create and think through objects today. And that's really central to this research. I'm also very aware that I am giving this presentation in Chicago, which, as you all know, is the home of the 1893 World's Columbian Exhibition, which was often referred to as a great object lesson. It was often referred to as this great object lesson and what you could learn about the world through things. And this was an event that was founded on a deep belief in object-based epistemology and object-based knowledge, and on the idea that knowing could be developed through direct physical experience with meaningful things. Where does the notion that objects can convey and transmit legible ideas come from? And how does that connect to language and our limited abilities to express those ideas? And I'm quite interested in thinking about how do we go from observation or from other sensory experiences to translating those experiences into language, into ideas that can be conveyed. Because there's often a real disconnect between what we can see, touch, feel, taste, and smell, and what we can express. And I wonder, Tim has already introduced us to this term of object lesson, but are many of you familiar with that term as a metaphor? Have you heard that used as a metaphor? No? Okay. It's a metaphor that's often used, some yeses and some nos, but it's a metaphor that's often used to describe any sort of concrete example. So this is a concrete example in, say, good government or bad government. It's a favorite of NPR, it's a favorite of New York Times columnists. And it's actually for me, it became quite funny as I kept looking for this phrase and realizing there's some writers who use the phrase object lesson a lot. And I hope that no one may look through the metaphors that I use repeatedly, but there's some that love that phrase. And it's often used alongside words like teachable moment to explain the presence of a compelling metaphor. But long before it had this meaning, long before this meaning became commonplace, there was an earlier meaning. And it was my interest in discovery of the phrase object lesson in early pedagogical textbooks, in the education libraries at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and other places, that helped me realize that there was actually a pedagogical practice called object lessons that was designed to teach teachers how to teach with objects. And I had only up until that time known object lessons as a metaphor. I had only known that second definition of the word. But my research quickly showed me that the metaphorical understanding of object lessons was its secondary definition. And this primary definition, a lesson in which a pupil's examination of a material object that forms the basis for its instruction, was actually its primary definition. A definition that had been erased by years and years of this metaphor being in circulation. So it's one of those instances where our familiarity with this phrase actually led to the erasure of this historic practice. The study of object lessons offers ways of finding ideas in things. A history that we take for granted when we see or explain the objects around us as symbols or metaphors. And this process has a history, and one that can help us explain the ideas that are present in the material world around us. In the late 19th century, thinkers believed that you could teach children to find ideas in boxes like this. Boxes full of all sorts of everyday things and wondrous things. That each of these items, similar to the teaching box that Tim was just describing to us, each of these items could open up a world of sensory possibility. But before we dive into these amazing boxes, and not many of these survive because many of them were used up. These are things that you would touch and pass around and engage with. Before we dive into these boxes, I want to offer a little bit of history into the object lesson idea. I place the origins of object lessons in the typically unorganized schoolrooms of this man named Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, and he lived in the late 18th and early 19th century, so this is a posthumous painting of him. He was a Romantic era pedagogue from Switzerland, and at the turn of the 19th century, he developed classroom practices premised on what he would describe as a mother's way of engaging with her children, a mother's approach to teaching. And he detailed this in many books that he wrote about a fictional mother named Gertrude. And the idea was that mothers tried to draw information out of their children. Mothers looked closely at their children. Mothers observed and learned from their children's every affect, every expression. And he believed that in doing that, rather than cramming information into them, mothers were drawing it out. And that was how children would best learn. And Pestalozzi's writings had a really significant impact on 19th century pedagogy more broadly. And in his teaching and writing, he emphasized this concept of Anschauung, which is a German word that those of you who might be familiar with Kant might know in other contexts. But Anschauung, this notion of your senses, or described as Anschauungsunterricht, sense training, sense perception exercises, were central to Pestalozzi's lessons. And in some ways, Anschauungsunterricht becomes a way to translate, becomes another word for object lessons. In Pestalozzi's model, children were first to develop sensation, then perception, and then moving from sensation and perception to notion and volition. The idea that you would begin to act based on what you had sensed and perceived and understood. You would learn how to act morally based on what you'd experienced. And this child-centered pedagogy explicitly linked learning to observe with learning to think. And it was this idea that became quite important to 19th century educators. As you see in this posthumous portrait, he's searching the faces of his students. He's trying to see them, trying to understand what they might be comprehending. And the object lesson fit into this world of material connection and exploration. He certainly didn't invent the notion that children would learn best through their interaction with and experience of the material world. Of course, we think about John Locke's tabula rasa concept and other thinkers. But he's someone who built on those experiences and created a really important set of pedagogical ideas. But in this context, he was the classic Romantic era hero. And what I mean by that, and it's maybe hard to tell in this painting, which is glorifying him, the man was a total mess. He was always dirty. His stockings were always falling down. There are stories that he had famously, almost run a knitting needle through his ears. He's absent-mindedly thinking about something. He's this Romantic era hero who's not organized. His schools are messy. And he would often talk about how he had a hard time even putting together one clear thought on paper. And in some ways, his way of approaching the world made object lessons make a lot of sense for him. He focused on the concrete, he focused on the direct. He loved this notion that you could start with a thing and develop a whole lesson out of a material thing. And so it's not Pestalozzi's writings on object lessons that people go to, because they're impossible to read, and they're impossible to translate. Not impossible, but very challenging, because he was a very disorganized thinker in his work. But his students took a lot of his ideas and transformed his notions of sensation, perception, notion, volition into systems of learning from objects, into systems that when they intersected with the common school movement in the United States and intersected with a whole range of colonial and evangelical projects in England, allowed these systems to be transferred not only across the United States, but really globally. And you see object lesson pedagogy appearing in classrooms around the world by the mid-19th century. And one of his students was an English man named Charles Mayo, who studied with him, and he returned to England. And Charles and his sister Elizabeth, who actually did all of the work in this relationship, even though everything is published as, Charles and his sister Elizabeth Mayo's work, developed Pestalozzi's work into a system, into a 5-step system that allowed a student to go from observation of an object to writing. It's a system that those of us who study material culture might recognize as a very familiar way of thinking about material culture study. It's very similar to the Brownian Method. It's very similar to a number of material culture approaches. And they sent this system basically throughout the British Empire, and from there, it was picked up by schools in the United States in the mid-19th century through the home and colonial school systems. So this 5-step method started with observation. Then you would study an object for its qualities. So what that means is, what makes this what I think it is? What does it smell like, taste like, look like, feel like? What makes this object what I'm claiming it to be? And this might seem like a very simple question, but those of you who think about designed objects know it is not a very simple question. What makes this a chair? What makes this? What are the qualities of this object that make it what I believe it to be? Next, what information am I bringing to this object that cannot be discerned through the senses? What do I know from the world, the life I've lived, the places I've gone, the assumptions that I make? Next, students were instructed to classify objects, to classify them into a category, and then finally to write about them. This is a lesson I often do in my own classes. This is a lesson that I often do on ginger as a way to illustrate how this works. So for example, you might start with a hunk of ginger. You could describe it. What is it? What does it feel like? And then think about what makes this ginger. What are its material qualities that really define this thing? Through the process, you're tasting and touching and looking and smelling and feeling. And then thinking about what are things that you bring to this object through this substance that you can't get just through your senses. What do you know, and how does that knowledge impact your sensory experiences? How might you sort it? Perhaps it's a category of objects called spices. Perhaps it's a category of things that grow in the ground. Perhaps it's a category of things that goes with a particular kind of food. Perhaps it's a category of things that you buy at a certain store. You come up with a category that makes sense for you, and then you were to write about it. And so the idea is that you would go from an object to a text. You would learn how to go from an object to a way of describing and explaining and translating your sensory experience of that object into language, which can often be a very complicated task and is one that aligns to writings about art, material culture, things that many of us do in our lives as scholars in the 21st century. There were cabinets of these objects available for teachers to purchase that went along with these textbooks. So you would purchase a book by the Mayos, and then you'd be able to find a cabinet that you could buy. This object lesson box from the V&A goes along directly with their textbooks. So you could imagine that same lesson on ginger being applied to quicksilver, to ivory, to an acorn, to a scissors, to a stone, to brown sugar. going through and defining all of these materials through your sensory engagement. So I guess part of that is learning about these experiences. Part of that, in a Lockean sense, is stocking your mind with all of these sensory experiences so you have them. But just as important was learning how to think. There was a very clear argument being made throughout all of these object lesson texts that engaging with material things would teach you how to think. In the 21st century, we think about that as critical thinking. We think about that as all of those higher order thinking skills that those of us who teach want to see our students doing, that those of you who are in classes, hope that your work shows. But the idea with object lessons is that all of that is rooted in education of the senses. And that starting with education of the senses at the roots, moving up through the trunk of perception, you would then branch out into all of these ways of thinking and learning. Perception of order, understanding of cause and effect, perception of difference. All of those qualities are central to the thinking skills that object teachers hope students would develop. So yes, you are stocking your mind with all of these sensory experiences, but rooting your study in the study of material things, you are learning how to think critically. And it's a very powerful argument for how and why we should be engaging not just with texts, but with the material world. And I actually feel in my own classes that's quite true. When students are faced with an object, they have to look closely. They have to make a connection between that object and an idea. And the thing is right there, right? The thing is right there in front of you. And it can be quite a meaningful learning and thinking opportunity. So by the 1860s, in the American context, which is what I focus on, though as I said, object lessons are truly a global phenomenon, and I've traced the practice throughout South America, all over Asia. There are lessons de cosas in Mexico, there are object lessons in Japan. Because this method becomes connected to a whole range of educational systems, it's everywhere. But by the 1860s, it's very popular in the United States and becomes bound up in the United States Common School movement. So I've traced object lessons through the training for teachers at places like the New York City Normal School, which is now Hunter College. And if you look at the ways teachers are being trained in the mid-19th century, most normal colleges are offering, normal colleges, schools where people went to learn to become teachers, most of those schools are offering training in object lessons by the 1860s. And students are explicitly learning how to use material things to describe the relationships between different kinds of objects. New York City begins offering special instruction in object teaching in the 1860s. California teachers' exam, starting in 1863, asked students, have you had any practice in giving object lessons? And the Chicago Tribune, since we're in Chicago, in 1862, offered a basic description of object lessons for its readers. The new feature in teaching, now being rapidly introduced everywhere, is object lessons. The idea simply is to present an object for a lesson instead of a picture or a description, but the real object. This real object being theoretically a nucleus around which is to be grouped the facts and relations pertaining to that object. So this is really an educational fad at this point. You see a whole range of teaching tools developing, like these objects used for teaching math, but also teaching relationships between objects and pictures. In this case, the teacher here in this classroom, illustrated in Harper's Weekly, is building a formal relationship between the sphere in her hand and the globe on the ground. So thinking about how do you get students to see shapes and understand the world around them. Or teachers thinking about how to build connections between natural history specimens and all of these materials all over the room, all of these different kinds of teaching materials. So there's a whole range of possibilities for teaching with these materials. Object lesson teaching cards like these really serve to problematize relationships between knowledge found in material things, knowledge found in text, and knowledge found in images. In these object lesson cards, you see actual substances tacked on or stitched on to these cards. The idea being a picture itself, a text, they were not the real thing. You needed the actual substance. You needed more sensory information in order to understand these things. Or thinking about the relationship between an unprocessed versus a processed substance. So you have text, images, objects, all of which approximate some understanding of a material thing, and all of these serving and carrying different weights in the classroom. What kinds of information do these different materials offer, which was central to the object lesson curriculum? Object lesson pedagogy was also applied as a kind of period eye to understand 19th century images used in the classroom. In this case, this is a lithograph of a girl leading a woman who is described to be blind across a bridge. And the idea was that you would apply the same object lesson pedagogy to this image, but instead saying, describe the image. What are the qualities of this image? What information are you bringing to this image? And in lesson plans that go along with it, questions like, how do you know the woman is blind? How do you know the child is kind? What information, what assumptions do you bring to this image? And then students would write about it. Similarly, thinking about, how do you know this is a happy home? What information do you see? And lessons that go along with it would be things as simple as, I see a spoon in a saucer. I see clothes hung up on a hook. I see an orderly home. And connecting those small details to the larger story of the image. In these ways, we see how children are explicitly learning through object lesson methods to what we would describe as read an image. Think about the information and stories embedded in images that were used in the classroom. In a similar way, object lesson methods were applied to images created directly for object teaching, of course. And in these lithographs, we see there is a crystallization of work processes presented in these images. In this case, this is a kitchen scene where students are designed to understand where is the work. They're designed to help students understand where is the work in this home? Where do I see work? How do I understand labor in this image? Or in this case, this lithograph, the students are learning how to make a lithograph. They're understanding all of the different qualities of the process of creating a lithograph. And in this case, applying that knowledge to the object they would be holding in their hand, the lithograph itself, right? So understanding how that object, that lithograph, becomes in and of itself a crystallization of all of the labor and work that are depicted here in the scene that's making it. And so object lesson methods were also used to help students and teachers rethink the very educational materials they were using. Similarly, this printed card, which is about type metal, is obviously printed, but is also about the process by which it was printed. So these sorts of lessons challenge students to understand even their textbooks, even their classroom teaching materials, as objects from which they can learn about process, as objects from which they can learn about making, as things that are not just objects that exist in the world as disembodied texts, but are themselves the subjects of object lessons. And in all of these sorts of teaching materials, there is a really interesting way in which knowledge is conveyed. Where is the knowledge resting here? Is it in the process? Is it in the text? Is it in the little pieces of type that provide crucial information, but yet are only here as part of a larger system? And these lessons really challenge students to try to understand everything about them as having knowledge-bearing possibility, not just the words on a page. Object lesson materials were also adapted for the education of the blind, the deafblind, and the deaf. And in many cases, these lessons focused on teaching those students about the senses, about senses they may or may not have access to, but thinking about it in a materially grounded and focused way. So there are all of these different ways in which this kind of object-based study was used in an object lesson classroom. And I cannot overestimate how popular these methods were in the mid-19th century. I've traced them in common schools throughout the United States. They would often be described as a separate class you would take during the day. Object teaching or object lessons could be a separate class in the 1860s and 70s that students would participate in. But that history has really been erased because of the popularity of the metaphor. So there was an assumption that those classes, that people were just using that phrase metaphorically, when in fact that metaphor had that foundation. Most of us who might find some familiarity with these methods might think of it as connected to kindergarten. We might see some of these object-based methods in a kindergarten context. And Friedrich Froebel was one of the men who studied with Pestalozzi and learned from him and transformed his ideas into a system that developed into kindergarten. So that's one of the places where you see object lesson methods continue in a clear and direct, with a clear and direct lineage. But of course, as with any pedagogy, particularly in the context of the 19th century United States, there are a lot of ways in which this method was used in order to forward ends that we would think of today as being racist, or classist, and sexist. And it's important to understand that part of this history as well. Object lessons really engage with a number of complicated topics. So for example, the kindergarten, which I'm sharing with you here, was developed into a curriculum called the Kitchen Garden, which was a methodology that used kindergarten methods to teach girls what it felt like to be servants in the late 19th century. And these were primarily poor and immigrant girls, most of whom were Irish immigrants in the Northeast in the late 19th century, starting around 1875. So just as the kindergarten movement was designed to teach you how to think expansively and how to feel and how to engage, the kitchen garden movement was about controlling your senses, learning how not to show your feelings. You might engage with objects, but you were engaging with them in a way that that encouraged you to learn how to lay the silverware straight, how to know if the soup was salted correctly. It was sensory training, but in a very different way. Kindergarten songs like The Cuckoo or Brotherly Love were turned into songs about things like We Are Little Waiting Girls, waiting on the door, or songs that were about musical play came to be about listening for the bell. So some of these methods were translated into classes that served very different ends from 1875 to about 1910. Another important aspect of object lesson pedagogy was the way it was unevenly applied or understood in relation to histories of race and racism in the United States. In this case, I'm showing you one of those object lesson cards, like the ones we looked at earlier. And this is a card designed to teach children about cotton, about understanding that textile. And the way this lesson is presented, we are engaging with it as if we are consumers. Yes, we have the cotton boll and seeds and the leaf here, but then we have all of these other materials and fabrics that we can choose from and that we can learn from and understand where they come from. Right, we have this mini commercial museum view of what is cotton. And students in northern classrooms learned object lessons in this way. But at the same time, in the late 19th century, children who were the children of sharecroppers or formerly enslaved peoples were also learning through object lessons. This is an example of an object lesson being offered in a school in Tuskegee, Alabama, to the children of freemen. And cotton in that context has a very different resonance. They're not engaging with it as consumers necessarily, even though they're likely wearing cotton somewhere in their bodies, but engaging with it as a lump of cotton balls on the table. Thinking about it more from maybe a production context. Similarly, at the Hampton Institute, this is a primary school at the Hampton Institute in Virginia. In 1899, you can see on the table there are these cotton branches with the bolls of cotton still attached to it. The students in this case are learning about cotton by turning those cotton bolls into threads by running them between their fingers. Yes, this is a material activity. Yes, they are learning about cotton and perhaps where thread comes from. But it has a very different resonance and very different set of meanings in this context. And in fact, the parents of students in this school complained and they said, They did not want their children playing with cotton balls or engaging with objects. They wanted their children to learn to read. They wanted their children to get the education that those parents and grandparents had been denied under slavery. And so the object lesson pedagogy is really unevenly applied in various ways. And it also is applied at places like Hampton in some quite disturbing ways. The Hampton Institute was a school that was founded in the years after the Civil War to educate freed African Americans and later Native Americans. And it is now Hampton University in Virginia, and for many years was an industrial school where the students there learned trades as opposed to getting a classical education. And images like this one from Hampton reveal one of the school's underlying educational goals. As the head of Hampton in the 1860s described, at Hampton there are 90, and at Carlisle there are nearly 300 Indians, boys and girls who are learning civilization as an object lesson and are themselves an object lesson. At Hampton, the object lesson pedagogy was used to teach students, and it also was applied to the bodies of students. It became a way not just to teach the students, but a way to talk about them and talk about their worthiness for resources, to be able to talk about their worthiness to be viewed as citizens. And it's in that context that we begin to see this becoming more and more of a metaphor. Now, of course, in this image, and this is quite a famous photograph, it was displayed at MoMA in the 40s. It's by Francis Benjamin Johnson, who is quite an important photographer. But we're looking at a photograph of a man named Louis Firetail, later Fire, who's almost certainly playing Indian, to use the words of Phil Deloria. He's almost certainly dressed up in a costume at this point and being presented as a lesson, as an object lesson to his classmates. Because when students arrived on campus, they were almost immediately taken out of any native clothing that they had. Their hair would have been cut, and they would have been transformed into Hampton cadets. So images like this one help us think about how student bodies are being used and transformed into object lessons, even as the methods and the teaching practices that they're using, they might be studying this taxidermy eagle, but they are also certainly studying him as a lesson as well. But that pedagogy also was something that the students themselves used and had access to in other ways, further complicating the story. These are some other pictures of Louis Firetail, the young man in that image, that I found. His wedding photo. Unfortunately, it's not a great image, but that's the best we have. His wedding photo from his marriage to a woman who was also a graduate of an Indian school, in this case, the Carlisle Indian School in 1899. And their wedding was actually reported in the New York Times because there was a double wedding with another couple who they was worthy of noting because they were a white couple. And in correspondence with Hampton, Louis would later describe his work as a carpenter in South Dakota, where he and his wife worked, and his plans to use the skills he honed at his school. So in the image of Louis shown here, we see a young man who is very fashionably dressed, very different from the image presented to his class earlier, right? But he's also engaging in object lesson ideology when he presents himself in this way. In descriptions of students living on the reservation where they moved, they were often described as object lessons, as models to their own people, as quote, models to their own people to show others what can be made of them. The idea was that Louis could be one kind of object lesson at Hampton and using the same sort of pedagogy, the same sort of way of reasoning, a very different kind of object lesson at the Crow Creek Reservation where he moved. Object lessons like this that were meant to document the civility of Native students were one way that reformers tried to argue for their political rights through material and visual evidence of their bodies and their actions. And this way of reasoning is deeply racist and deeply problematic because it's not arguing for their rights based on any sort of natural rights, but arguing for the rights of African American and Native American students based on how they look, based on how they appear, based on what happens when you apply an object lesson to their bodies. Booker T. Washington, who would graduate from Hampton and go on to start his own school, described the same thing of the Tuskegee Institute. They were sending out a class of leaders who go out among their people as object lessons. And these are the kinds of lessons in the way of reasoning from object to idea, from person to abstract concept, that I think about a lot when I think about racial profiling, when I think about some of these very contemporary issues and questions of how and why we go from looking at a person to making assumptions about that person. Who looks like they have the rights of citizens and who doesn't? And that's very much embedded in this history of object lesson rhetoric, that you can actually go from just what you see to a bigger idea or set of claims. And we have to hope that the study of object lessons today in the 21st century could ask us to interrogate those assumptions and to think about what happens when we're drawing conclusions just from what we might see and what we think we know about the world. And it's in places like Hampton, with this kind of rhetoric where lessons are both in the classroom and applied to the bodies of people as metaphors, that the object lesson idea begins to disappear into the metaphor that we know today. You start to see object lessons being used in advertisements. It was a popular term in advertisements in the late 19th century. This woman dressed very much like a teacher. Clearly, this soap is an object lesson in what makes something good soap. Or thinking about other kinds of trade cards where the object lesson idea is used to encourage one to imagine going from that object to a much bigger set of ideas about it. Object lessons were also used to think about political questions and political issues, like the McKinley Tariff of 1890. In this case, a protest for that tariff was actually printed on a tin card, that the idea of which was that you would hold this card in your hand, and this was a card that was made of imported tin plate, and there was a parallel card that was made of domestic tin plate, and voters were challenged to tell the difference between the two. The idea was that when you actually engaged with material things, as opposed to big abstract ideas or systems of power, you might begin to understand that actually the object itself contains some answers. And in this case, the answer was foreign and domestic tin plate was exactly the same and should not be taxed differently. I thought about these objects a lot last summer during the tariff debates, and wrote about this issue in an op-ed for the Washington Post about how when we're thinking about big systems of power, we're often not thinking about the objects that tariff debates might actually be rooted in. Object lessons and material knowledge are really needed to understand the real impact of larger international systems or debates around things like tariffs. How do we understand the objects that are impacted? Can we understand those objects, and can those help us make better political decisions? These are all explicitly object stories, or should be. And all of this relates to the work I did for many years at the Chipstone Foundation, where I spent a lot of time creating period rooms. I spent a lot of time creating spaces in which material narratives would unfold through engagement with very specific and carefully selected objects, like our 70s room or Mrs. M's cabinet. And at Chipstone, I worked to develop my ideas about object lessons, the history of object lessons, into a method that could be used and applied in modern classrooms. And this is something that I continue to work around and think about in my research and writing and teaching. The 5 steps of the object lesson method can really be transformed into productive and useful classroom exercises. Thinking about going from basic description and initial observation to understanding objects' physical qualities, understanding what's not there that you can't get just from looking, classifying and arranging, and synthesis and interpretation. And this is a method that has been incredibly helpful in teaching and developing exhibitions, but also can be tweaked and twisted and turned in lots of different contexts. And I'm currently collaborating with a colleague at the Stanford D School and some colleagues at UW-Madison who teach design thinking and design strategy to think about how this method actually connects to design thinking methods and help us think about how to move from object to idea, from idea back to object, and think about all of the steps in that process as a way to try to interrogate all of the assumptions we make as we move along that trajectory from a concrete thing to abstract ideas about and around that thing. How do we move between those two poles? The object lesson method, for me, has proven to be a surprisingly relevant way to engage with material things, even though the method itself is more than 150 years old. And it's helped me acknowledge that things have an intellectual history, that the way we understand things is part of intellectual history, that there isn't a separation between the study of objects and the study of text, or at least there shouldn't be, because objects indeed have ideas embedded in them. We just don't always see it or find a way to make it legible. And while I want to engage in these conversations as a scholar, as a professor, curator, researcher, and writer, I also hope that this method makes us more aware of the ideas and implications of the things around us as people who create objects, who make choices about objects, who engage with objects every day. Thank you. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm curious, was there contention around these ideas at the time in the literature that you're reading? Was this interrogated, and how?
Yeah, there was. It was definitely the major topic of debate in the 1860s in pedagogical circles. And some of the concerns were that people loved the concept of object lessons, but were concerned about how it was implemented. So the idea was that children aren't actually learning to think more expansively. They're just learning to pare it back and memorize other kinds of ideas. So for example, if I were to do that lesson on ginger, and I told you, okay, ginger, everyone, it's opaque, it's pungent, it's pulverable. And then I didn't show you any ginger, and I say, tell me how ginger is. And everyone recited in unison, opaque, pulverable, pungent. Then the object lesson wasn't actually being done in the spirit of the lesson. So a lot of critics felt that it wasn't being applied correctly because there was this belief that you couldn't actually read about object lessons in a book but had to learn it from someone else, which is part of why normal schools became such a popular way to share. Even though there were many books, the idea was that you had to actually learn it from someone else. It was almost like an apprenticeship model in that way. Another set of critiques was that children who were normative did not need to learn this way. They could just figure it out on their own. So there's a very interesting history of object lessons being used in schools primarily for students who we would now consider to be disabled, like the New York School, the unfortunately named New York School for Idiots in the 19th century, was a school in which they said, we can use object lessons here, but you don't need to use them elsewhere. And so there was debate around that too, that children who might have might be viewed as having a normative sensory abilities, they don't need to have someone teach them this is pungent because they're just going to figure it out anyway. So there was a debate around that, but yet it still ended up being in common schools throughout the United States in those periods. And part of why the method ends up disappearing, I think, is because these methods, the objective ways of teaching end up being incorporated into lots of different kinds of classes. So the use of images in the classroom as lithography becomes, and printing becomes an easier way to have images in the classroom. The use of objects in classrooms, teaching collections, teaching museums. You start to see more and more of those things in classrooms, and the fad ends.
Thank you. That was wonderful. My question was sort of triggered by the one of the early examples of the boxes that you showed, where Indian rubber was included, and I started to think about sort of what kinds of objects are being included. and seeing that sort of made me wonder, to what degree could you also read colonialism or empire in these, in the selections of materials? So are they primarily sort of local materials that one might come across in sort of a daily experience within a certain region where the boxes were being circulated, or are they actually also sort of acquainting people with materials that would have come from sort of distant places, and thus we could read sort of the reach of empire into the boxes?
Yeah, absolutely. Both of those things are happening, but quite explicitly, object lesson boxes were connected to empire and ideas of belonging to a much bigger system, and thinking about the objects one had access to because of systems of empire and trade. And so oftentimes object lessons, when you get to that third step, which the associative step, where you're thinking of things outside of it, that would incorporate a geography lesson, a history lesson. So understanding, how do we have access to this material? Where does it come from? What kinds of people are from this part of the world? And all of the associated colonial stories that would go along with that. So teachers who were instructed to make their own object lesson boxes, if you couldn't afford something like this, you would have lists of things, and some of those things you could acquire locally. Some of those things you might have to send away for. Some of those things would be locally acquired, but foreign objects that would be brought in through trade networks. So it was very much about learning where those objects come from and learning about how they got to where you are. And is also training you to be a consumer of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate this tonight. That was great. Thank you. I have I guess maybe a cluster of questions, if you don't mind responding to whatever you see fit to respond to.
Sure.
And a couple of them might sound flippant, and I don't mean them to be so at all. I mean them all seriously. So just that as a preface. You talked about this method of observation with object lessons having to do in part with studying an object for its qualities. And I guess part of what I want to ask is if you could reflect a little bit on the concept of objects as an object, maybe. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I'm wondering here is one of the through lines is a kind of distinction between texts, images, and objects, right? And in the presentation tonight, where you're teaching us about this, we see, texts both on the screen and verbally presented. We see images, including images of objects. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering why not use objects in your lesson about object lessons tonight, mm-hmm. and what that might mean, the absence of the object there. And then along those lines, I'm wondering about treating texts, and I don't just mean like poetry, but philosophical texts as objects. One of the things that I try to emphasize with students is or ask them to focus upon the kind of material qualities of even a philosophical text. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering again about the kind of contours of the concept of objects. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I love all of those questions, and I'm going to try to remember them. But I want to answer all of them, so remind me if I forgot one. In terms of the form of the presentation, I often present on object lessons with objects, but I wasn't quite sure how that would work in this context. So that is a limitation, and I think when you actually engage in an object lesson, what happens oftentimes when you get especially to that third step, the step about qualities that cannot be discerned merely from the senses, really interesting things happen in audiences, because that's when you begin to understand some of the differences among your audience members, right? And that's when you begin to understand people's different life experiences, and that sets in high relief the assumptions we often make about material things. So I absolutely agree that it's much more effective when I'm able to present this information in a small group where we're engaging with material things directly. And that's
Just
how
clear,
object teachers would have done it historically.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes. And I didn't mean to suggest it would have been more effective. I just wondered
Yep,
what that
yep, no, exactly. But in my own instinctual approach, like that's how I would like to tell that story, because that shows you through your bodily response. You're like, wait a minute, I want to say that this might be foreign, right? Depending on what it is. But I don't know why I want to say that, and it actually doesn't come from what I'm tasting, smelling, touching, or feeling. Where is that coming from? And in a classroom of students or of colleagues, that opens up very interesting and meaningful conversations that helps us think about the connection between object study and what I was sort of hinting at later, just sort of thinking about racial profiling, cultural stereotypes, and how objects connect to that. Let's see. Remind me. Texts.
Yes, right. And
So-
maybe photos as objects as well.
So it's an interesting problem because within the history of the pedagogy itself, object lesson methods, often described as picture lessons, could also be applied to the study of images. And the object lesson method was also applied to objects as texts, as I presented, to help students understand and really problematize the notion that a text is something disembodied, which of course we know it's not. I think it can be quite effective to apply those same methods to text. And when I teach material culture, I also always teach poetry along with it, because I believe quite strongly the study of objects and the study of poems are very closely connected because of the effective response you have to both of those different categories of things, right? I think you certainly could do the same thing to other kinds of texts. I find it most effective with a poem because that typically, like an object, is bounded and short. Whereas with a longer text, you get into questions about its boundedness. I have purposely not engaged with thinking about objects versus things because in the period that I'm working with, that wasn't as much of a problem. Object lessons were often applied to substances. Object lessons could be applied to things that we might not think of as objects in the same way that we might talk about today in a theoretical like thing theory, Bill Brown sense, right? There's another question.
I think that was awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to talk more. We're on the same wavelength in terms of these pretty big knowledge problems. Yeah.
I wonder if you could just like make explicit some what I think is like kind of in between the lines here around like capitalism, commodification, and consumption, right? Or one question I have is just like, is this a kind of in the background of Marx's Capital, or is that book, I guess especially the first part of it, an object lesson?
That's interesting. I mean, I think about a lot of this in terms of thinking about how objects and I was hinting at that by thinking about like a crystallization of labor into objects, thinking about objects as labor brought together. But, I haven't actually, oddly, explicitly thought about that as an object lesson. Though, of course, the way in which a lot of the argumentation goes certainly could be understood in that way.
Well, maybe I can add like a step 2.
That's really
to that
interesting.
Question we can.
It's a great question.
But
yeah.
maybe like a stage 2 of that is, I thought, it's just basically the question, right? If Marx argues that things change their nature when they go into the marketplace, right? Like the thing that or you think what wood is, a wooden table is, then it like becomes something different.
Right.
What that might not be as knowable. And I just wondered, like materially, if that comes up here too, right? Because in this period, there's all these like imitation materials, like rubber, acting as jade or as
there's a
whatever.
I mean, yes, I think that is. There's a lot of talk about the problem of king sham, right? And king sham being like this notion that is this thing what you think it is? And what's interesting is that in this context, that is applied to the study of material things, as well as to the study of people and social situations. So the idea is that there's this quote, I'm not going to get it quite right, but it's something like, once your mind is used to the accurate investigation of material things, like you will be able to accurately understand like moral questions and social questions, basically is the meat of it. So the idea was that object lessons would teach you how to see through things. So in some ways, I think of it as definitely connected to this 19th century rise of the confidence man, the worries about is that what you think it is. But in terms of thinking about objects objects like wood changing when they are turned into commodities, students are learning about things in a natural state and learning about things in a produced state, and they're connecting those. So potentially, I think one could make an argument that this is directly engaging with that problem.
Is there any kind of a connection that you've seen, or that maybe you can illuminate for me, with the museum practice of collecting plaster casts? And were the plaster casts an outgrowth of like object lessons, or did the object lesson kind of say they're fake, so now we need to not value them as much?
I haven't seen as much object lesson pedagogy directly connected to plaster casts, so there's that part of it. But I think they're part of the same like broader long 19th century desire to engage with material things and to think about some sort of direct engagement with an object. I haven't necessarily come across anything in my research that explicitly would point to a plaster cast being something that is a good thing or a bad thing, but I have seen plaster casts used in object lessons as a connection to, say, I can think of one example where it was marble, plaster, an image of a statue, and thinking about all of the different ways that you could engage with sculpture, right? Like that is one way that plaster casts came into that mode of teaching. But you see plaster casts in lots of 19th century schools that are also engaging in object lesson pedagogy, so I'm not sure anyone agonized over that difference in the way we might or might want to.
Hi, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how an adult who we would say went through the traditional sort of classical definition of education might still be able to interact with an object lesson in a way that's different from kids who are presented it as a way of learning.
That's interesting. I mean, I think premised at the root of that question is this notion that you might really believe that this way of learning could transform someone, right? Or could make someone as an adult have a very different set of sensory experiences or have a different way of engaging with the world, which I do believe and think is true. I feel like anyone could be open to learning in that way, but an adult who didn't go through this system might be doing a bit more of what we're doing right now, which is intellectualizing it, as opposed to thinking about this as becoming just the qualities of someone's body and way of moving in the world. When this was a popular pedagogical practice, it just, like, I see it as something that helped shape the 19th century's focus on material things. I mean, historians think of the 19th century as being this period which is very focused on object-based knowledge. The rise of the department stores, the rise of museums, places where you go to look at things and engage with things. And that went hand in hand with this way of teaching children to engage materially with a whole range of objects and to learn about those objects. And I'm not necessarily saying that there's a direct causal relationship there, but that's part of this culture, right? And so students who grew up within that context were also growing up in that much broader world. But I do think it's quite possible as a classroom activity or as a research tool. Like if you were to think about researching an object, this can be a great way to start with that object. And then to even say, well, what are the categories that I'm creating? And you might quickly realize the categories you're creating are becoming the argument you're making, right? Where are you placing this thing? That is an argument in and of itself.
Thank you.
Hi. I am wondering how much these objects are connected to making. Strangely, I was taught not that dissimilarly. I grew up in Germany where these images were all around me when I was in elementary school. And I know from my own artistic practice that my way of thinking has direct roots to how I made things early on, and recurring patterns have become intellectual epistemes. It's an incredibly interesting thing to learn about yourself. But when I'm thinking of this time, handmaking was also much more common still, and I'm wondering if it's not going just from raw material to product, but if there were also pedagogical moments where the making was part of it, and how that would then impact the learning and the thinking of the future adult.
It's a great question. So in object lesson curriculum in 19th century common schools, making wasn't a big part of it. In Froebel's interpretation and transformation of object lessons into kindergarten, making is at the heart of it, right? So And that version of object lessons, which is the version that becomes quite popular and that's how most people still engage with object lessons in some way, either through kindergarten or through Montessori. If we make a family tree of these ideas, Maria Montessori sort of falls, under Froebel in an interesting way, or we might think of like Waldorf schools and other sorts of there's this big sort of intellectual tree with Pestalozzi at the top, right? So within kindergarten, the kindergarten gifts that Froebel created are all about different ways of making, starting with, folding paper, all the way up to elaborate cutting and weaving. And so that is very much a part of this. And I know in my classes, when I teach about object lessons, I have the students engage in those activities to think about the intellectual content of, like, what does it mean to make this origami piece? Like, actually, how do you follow instructions? Many of you are makers, so this isn't as interesting to you. But for non-makers, it can be kind of mind-blowing where they're like, wait a minute, I have to sit here and make this thing now? And how does this connect to what we're learning and these abstract ideas that you're teaching me about? So it is part of it in that way. Yeah.
So it's my understanding that knickknacks are on the decline. Do you believe knickknacks are on the decline in contemporary consciousness as well as production? And what do you think what do you predict the effect of that situation is? Because we can assume that I think we can read into and assume the probable causes for the situation of knickknacks being on the decline. But what do you think the overall effect may be of people no longer interacting with these novel and representational objects?
I have this great privilege sometimes of being a historian, right? And so I don't know what will happen. I don't know how to answer that question. It's really interesting, though, because if you imagine there's less of a value being placed on his collectible objects, on historic or handmade objects. I know within the decorative arts world, which is a world that I come from, there is people are not buying old things in the same way that they used to, or keeping and collecting and preserving and saving old things in the same way that they used to, right? Or those things don't have the same market value necessarily that they used to. But those things, it comes in waves too. If we look at histories of, values of objects that could be defined as knickknacks, those things may well end up being very valuable and loved and appreciated again. I'm not sure how else to answer that question. Does anyone else have any thoughts on collectible objects, on knickknacks? I think it's an interesting question. What happens when you don't live with things? Is that what you're getting at? Like, what happens if you don't have these things around you? I think you might, I think there is a loss of knowledge. Because when I look at a box like this, I see a box truly full of ideas and knowledge that you can develop through your engagement with these material things. And as you develop that knowledge and that understanding of those things, you can think about, as I said, all different ways of higher order thinking and connection making and all kinds of creative thought. So I hope that, I hope people still like and connect with material things, says the museum curator in me.
I wanted to return to the question about making, really, and just try to link some of the object lesson pedagogy with the kind of critique experiences that many of the students may have had here, because it seems like there is some sort of striking parallels between the two, and particularly, I mean, I'd seen a different but ultimately very, or a system that uses different language to describe what a good critique might look like, and it was it should start with descriptions and move into interpretations, and then end with evaluations. And so that maps fairly nicely onto the sort of 5 different steps that you showed. But it also made me think about the sort of histories of art and design education, and it seemed like while object lessons may have become less popular in general education, I wonder whether you had sort of seen the way, or whether you think of the object lesson as being something that is picked up in, for example, the Bauhaus's sort of 4-course, or the things that become foundation courses in art and design, which generally kind of deal with the direct experience of materials as the sort of jumping off point for creativity.
I think that's absolutely right. And I've hesitated to make that connection too directly, because I think it does go through an interesting prism in terms of thinking about education for younger people versus older people, different kinds of education. But I think there is a direct intellectual thread between object lessons and this kind of object-based focus and thinking about what's happening in the Bauhaus, but also what's happening in art history education. I know at Harvard, where I did my training and where Jules Prown did his training, Jules Prown is someone who wrote the Brownian Method, which is a method of object-based pedagogy quite similar to this in approach, right? He's this very, very, very sweet old man who, when I asked him about this, he was like, I'm not that old, Sarah. Like, how old do you think I am? He's like in his mid-90s, right? But he did not actually learn from this method. But in talking with him and working with him, he studied with German formalists at Harvard in the early 20th century. And he studied, they did connoisseurship exercises, which are very similar to thinking about object lesson exercises as part of their art history education. And also was a student of new criticism. In some ways, new criticism, which as a movement in the early 20th century in the United States to study texts, is very similar to object lesson-based pedagogy, where you just start with the thing itself, right? And in some ways, you end up with a bit of a formalist approach. You're starting with the thing itself. It's all you need. And from that thing, you can twist out in this spiral of ideas. So there are lots of intellectual connections to Bauhaus, to art history education, to new criticism, lots of ways that those ideas connect. But I feel like it's tricky sometimes to draw a direct, it's something that it's more of a, there is a connection, there is a parallel, we can make that claim, but I don't know if there's a direct causal relationship, though I'm sure there are causal relationships. Yeah, it's a great connection to make. Thank you for underlining it.
And I mean, you touched briefly on sort of critiques of the method earlier, but from a sort of design perspective, something that has been mentioned in when discussing creating new things is of course, well, language can be limiting in that context, and if you're designing a chair, if you start talking about chairs, and then we are all thinking about our existing understanding of what a chair is, whereas if you start talking about, well, how the body might be suspended in a way that is comfortable, and then you can avoid some of that. And so, I mean, did those sorts of critiques come up in relation to the limitations around object lessons?
Not in that way. I mean, I think that those are fair critiques, but the kinds of critiques that would come up would be things like, for example, Charles Dickens actually did a pretty famous critique of object lessons in the mid-19th century, where he, in his book Hard Times, has this long passage where he makes fun of this teacher, Mr. Gradgrind, who basically has the students memorize all of the parts of a horse. It's a quadruped. It has, going on and on, these like long, complicated words to describe a horse, right? The idea being this is empty language, and the student in the room who actually knows the most about the horses is a student who doesn't know any of those words, but his parents are circus performers and he loves horses. So it's this idea being like, who knows more about the horse? The person who can parrot back the language, or the person who's actually ridden a bunch of horses and understands them and knows how to care for them? So that was also a common critique, that it was like, how do you show off your knowledge? Do you show your knowledge through creating something, through doing something like riding a horse, through making something, or is it just a performance of words? And I think that's a really interesting critique that you can bring to lots of different pedagogical approaches. Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? No? Last chance. Okay, well, thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you. Those were great questions.